Okay, so we talked about the development of the Constitution and all of the compromises and hurdles that the Founding Fathers had to essentially deal with or jump in order to get that document created. But the document still has another hurdle to clear, and that's going to be ratification. And so our course learning objectives are to identify the steps necessary to ratify the Constitution, describe the arguments of the Federalists in favor of a strong national government, and describe the arguments of the Anti-Federalists in favor of a weaker national government. And our departmental learning objectives are to explain the origins and development of the constitutional democracy in the United States and to demonstrate knowledge of the federal system. And so our essential questions are, what are the steps to ratifying the Constitution? What were the arguments used by the Federalists in favor of ratification? And what were the arguments used by the Anti-Federalists against ratification? So immediately coming out of the convention, battle lines are going to be drawn. And in Article 7 of the Constitution, which is the final article of the Constitution, it is required that the states ratify the Constitution, and ratify simply means to approve. And so in September of 1787, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia are going to vote to approve or ratify the document, and they're going to send it out to the states. Even though it was approved by the convention, you have to understand that not everyone at the convention really supported the document. There were some significant opposers to the document, and so the battle lines are going to be drawn pretty quickly, and they're going to divide into a couple of different factions that will sort of be the precursors of our political parties. And so the ratification needed the approval of 9 out of the 13 states. So it wasn't a unanimous thing like the Articles of Confederation were, but 9 of 13 states had to approve it in order for it to go into effect. And so we're going to see some significant disapprovals of the Constitution. There's going to be some very significant people who come out against the Constitution for a number of different reasons. First of all, Patrick Henry. He fears that the new office of president would place too much power in the hands of one individual. They just fought the king. They didn't want to have another autocracy, and so he was really afraid of this new president creating a situation where they would expand their power too far and limit the rights of the individuals. He also didn't like the federal government's ability to tax citizens, and he believed that this should be something that stayed with the states, not the federal level. The thinking behind this is that the closer you get to the people, the more localized politics are, the more that level of government understands the people. And so with the federal government so far removed from the individuals, they're not going to understand the needs of the individuals. And so there's going to be Patrick Henry speaking out against this Constitution, ratification of the Constitution. Edmund Randolph, also from Virginia, he didn't like the new federal judicial system. He actually feared that the federal courts would be too far away from those who were tried by it. Remember, one of the grievances that the colonists are going to have is that they were not tried by a jury of their peers. They were removed from the colonies, had to stand trial back in Britain. And so with the new federal judicial system, having the ability to try individuals at the federal level, Randolph was afraid this was going to happen again, and people were going to be way too far removed from their people who understood the issues facing ordinary people in their particular region. And so Randolph's going to come out against this as well. He does believe that state courts could better understand the people who are tried in courts, because the more localized the government is, the closer to the people it is, and the thinking is they're going to understand those people way better than a large federal government that is removed from the citizenry. Overall, the biggest dissatisfaction with the new document was that it did not guarantee the protection of individual liberties, which was a major complaint that the colonists had against the British government. Was they were having their individual rights and liberties infringed upon. And so the federal government, as it was created in the Constitution, did not guarantee a jury trial. And so people are going to have an issue with this. They wanted this liberty of being tried by a jury of their peers. They did not guarantee religious tolerance. They didn't want to have to be associated with one particular religion over another, and the Constitution, as it was written, did not guarantee religious tolerance. Opponents are going to call for a Bill of Rights to remedy these issues that the government does not guarantee protection of individual rights. And so they'll actually refuse to ratify the Constitution without a Bill of Rights being added. And so there is going to be a big holdout in Virginia, and Virginia is going to be a huge dominant force in the new republic. They are a very large populous state, very powerful, and they're a huge holdout. And so while not all 13 states were necessary to ratify the Constitution, without Virginia, many people didn't really see the nation being very successful. And so Virginia is going to be a big holdout. And so there will be an agreement for a Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution following its ratification. And this is going to persuade some delegates to support the ratification. But the battle lines are drawn. Essentially, it is going to create a situation where larger states didn't really care for the Constitution, didn't really support ratification. Smaller states, more in favor of ratification. And so political factions are going to emerge, and these are going to be the precursors of our political parties. We've been a two-party political system since our inception, and so these factions are going to essentially be the seeds of our political parties. Federalists are going to emerge as the supporters of the Constitution. And Federalists tended to be the more elite members of society. They were wealthy, well-educated landowners, businessmen, and former military commanders. They believed in the necessity of a stronger government in order to maintain national defense as well as economic growth. They have seen what it was like under the Articles of Confederation, where there was no provisions for a national defense for the federal government to create an army to maintain national defense. And as the businessmen, they understand that there is a necessity of the national government to create economic growth, to regulate commerce so that individuals can be protected and make money in the United States economy. Support for Federalists was very strong in the New England areas, and so we're going to see different factions emerge. The second faction is going to be the Anti-Federalists. These are obviously the opponents of ratification. They feared the power of the national government. They really feared that the national government was going to be way too powerful and not really have the interest of the citizens at heart. And they believed that the state legislatures would be better positioned to protect the freedoms of the individuals because they're more localized. Anti-Federalists tended to be some wealthy individuals, but mostly it was a group of people who distrusted the elite, and they believed that the national government would eventually favor the elite and would not favor the middle class, average, everyday individuals. And so you've got these two factions that emerge, and although we're not going to do it in here, it is fascinating to read the Federalist Papers, but it's also fascinating to read what has kind of become known as the Anti-Federalist Papers, because there's a lot of parallels in what the Federalists were arguing for or against during this time period, there's a lot of parallels to a lot of the arguments that are still used in modern day to advance the idea of a small government and states' rights. So there's going to be some significant overlap um, with the arguments that were made back then to the arguments that are made even in modern day. The Federalists are going to end up winning out, clearly, but it's done with the promise of a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. And the Federalists are going to essentially go on a ratification campaign, and there's going to be lots of essays and pamphlets written in every state, both in support and against the Constitution. But the Federalist Papers, as I've said, are way more well known than the Anti-Federalist Papers. And in fact, because the Federalists are going to be the ones that come out on top, essentially, and the Constitution is ratified, the Federalist Papers are the ones that are going to be pushed more in history. And so it wasn't even until my master's that I actually sat down and read the documents associated with the Anti-Federalist Papers. But I found them to be very enlightening, and it helps me to see the debate from an entirely different angle, and it reminded me a lot of what's going on in America even in modern day. So it is very helpful to read those papers as well. And so if you go on to pursue a history or a political science degree, I hope that you will be exposed to those papers at some point. Typically, as historians, we just push the Federalist Papers because they are the ones that ended up coming out on top in this ratification campaign. But ratification, as I said, smaller states liked it and ratified it more quickly. New Hampshire is going to ratify the Constitution in 1788. Delaware will be the first. But when they do, when New Hampshire does ratify, they will become the 9th state to ratify. And so essentially the Constitution becomes law in June of 1788. However, even though we have 9 states that have ratified it, we have some very large holdouts. Virginia, as we've already talked about, as well as New York, are going to be 2 of the wealthiest and most populous states. And even though 9 states have already ratified it and it is essentially law, Virginia and New York hadn't. And so it would be really hard to have a successful new republic without the wealthy and populous Virginia and New York. And so if they were to go their own way, it could spell disaster for the new nation. In Virginia, James Madison is going to work tirelessly for ratification. And James Madison is actually the credited with being the author of the Constitution. He is going to work very, very tirelessly for ratification. And he, along with some other individuals, are going to be instrumental in writing those Federalist Papers. George Washington is actually going to have to intercede in order to convince Virginia and New York to ratify this document. A very well-respected individual who was the hero of the Revolutionary War, the president of the Constitutional Convention, extremely, extremely well respected. He is going to intercede on behalf of the Federalists and write letters convincing people like Edmund Randolph, who did not agree with the Constitution, that the new government was actually a very important thing. And so in June of 1788, Virginia will agree to approve the Constitution. So they become the 10th state to approve it. And this is a big win because Virginia is a wealthy and populous state, primarily made up of individuals who did not really like the Constitution, but they have agreed to ratify it and to agree to be governed by it. And so New York becomes the last large hurdle in ratification, and it's going to take quite a bit for New York to be convinced. We've talked about the Federalist Papers, and Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay are going to write a series of papers arguing in favor of a strong government. these are going, it's not really clear whether or not they help to sway anybody. But although they were compelling, we still don't have hard evidence that they swayed anybody one way or the other. But once Virginia approved the Constitution, New York realizes it doesn't have much of a choice. It realizes that, you know, this thing, they can kind of see the writing on the wall, if you want to use a cliche. They see where this thing is going, and so they will ratify it. Later, North Carolina will approve it, and Rhode Island will be the lone holdout. Remember, we talked about Rhode Island sort of being known as Rogues Island. They kind of always have done what they want to do and kind of gone their own way. They will actually not approve the Constitution until 1790. And also remember, they didn't send any delegates to the convention, so they didn't really have a hand in creating it. But they will eventually approve it in 1790 because everybody else had. And what is it? What are they going to do? Very tiny state. What is it that they're going to do if they do not join this this movement? And so they will approve it in 1790. And so this just kind of gives you an idea of where and when the different states approve it. And so, Delaware is going to be the first. Then you've got Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Then you have Georgia, interestingly enough, Connecticut and Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire. And then this is sort of where we have those hurdles. Virginia comes in. They will approve it just a little bit after New Hampshire does. New York will in another month or so, and then North Carolina and Rhode Island are going to be those ones bringing up the rear. With with Rhode Island really holding out. And so this is essentially the ratification process of the Constitution. And so I would like for you to review these essential questions, these objectives. And in the next lesson, we are going to talk about the amendments, because remember, the amendment process is going to play a key role in getting the Constitution approved by several of these states, because it is through this amendment process that the Bill of Rights will be added. All right, so I'll see you in the next lecture.